Have you ever felt the past come alive again, emerging from the darkness in a place where you least expected it? Like a ghost standing beside you, watching from the shadows. My name is Jonathan. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who seeks logic even in the most illogical of places. But what happened to me shook my belief in rationality, like autumn leaves trembling under the gusts of wind. It happened one rainy evening as I embarked on a long journey to the depths of the southern states. The sky, shrouded in leaden clouds, wept, and each raindrop pounded against the windshield with desperate force. Thunder shattered the silence of the night, as if warning of something unknown. I was exhausted and irritated, so when I saw a small town appear on the side of the road, I decided to stop for the night. My attention was drawn to an old hotel standing apart from the main road. The sign above the door read, "Blackwood Hotel." Its letters, chipped and nearly erased by time, faintly glimmered in the flickering light of the car's headlights. The hotel looked abandoned, the windows were dark, and the paint on the weathered walls had long since lost its color. But in one of the upper windows, a faint light flickered. A strange sensation crept over me, a mix of unease and solace. I parked the car by the entrance, but before stepping out, I sat for a while, staring at the building. There was something about its somber grandeur that stirred an odd sense of anxiety in me, yet at the same time, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Stepping inside, I felt as if I had entered another era. The atmosphere of the old hotel enveloped me like a web, drawing me into some ancient mystery. The spacious lobby, which must have once impressed guests with its grandeur, now stood as a silent witness to its own decline. A massive chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its crystal pendants dimly glinting under the weak light of a few lamps. The floor, covered with a worn-out carpet, creaked under my steps, and the air was thick with the smell of dampness, mingled with the bitter scent of aged wood. Behind the reception desk stood a man. He seemed to be a part of the place itself, a silent, motionless statue carved out of centuries past. His face was pale and gaunt, as if time and life had long since stripped it of any emotion. Deep wrinkles etched into his skin resembled cracks on ancient portraits, and his eyes, those eyes, like bottomless pits, weren't looking at me but through me, as if assessing something I couldn't see. "Do you need a room?" he asked, his voice quiet but piercingly cold, like the chill of a winter wind. I nodded, though the unease in my chest tightened further. His voice was so calm it felt unnatural. The tone sent a shiver down my spine, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn back. Something about this place pulled at me like a magnet. "You'll be in room 212, he said, his hand moving slowly toward an old wooden drawer. He retrieved a key attached to a heavy metal tag engraved with the room number. Handing it to me, he held his gaze on me a moment longer than necessary, sending an uncomfortable chill through me. A registry book lay on the counter. Its tattered pages were filled with names, each scrawled as though signed by hands long since forgotten. One name caught my eye, crossed out so violently that the paper was nearly torn through. The ink had bled, and dark scratches from the pen lingered beside it. My heart skipped for a moment, but I didn't dare ask about it. Feeling uneasy, I took the key silently and headed toward the stairs, though the sense of dread refused to leave me. It felt as if the very walls of the hotel were quietly observing my every move. As I ascended to the second floor, it felt as though the atmosphere grew even heavier, the space around me almost unreal. The stairs creaked loudly and drawn out beneath my feet, like an old musical instrument long out of tune. The sound echoed through the oppressive silence, and it struck me as strange, almost as if I were the only soul in the entire hotel. The corridor greeted me with dim light. The walls, worn by time, were adorned with old paintings. The landscapes depicted on them seemed as though they had once been enchanting, but now they were ruined by dampness. Dark stains had eaten away at the paint, and the wooden frames were cracked. The barely discernible silhouettes of trees and mountains looked more like shadows than images, as if the paintings themselves had lost their soul. I stopped before the door marked 212. It looked just like the rest of the hotel, old, battered, with peeling paint that revealed the gray, time-worn wooden frame beneath. The key in my hand felt heavier than it should have, but I brushed the thought aside. Turning the lock, I stepped inside and found myself in a space where time seemed to have frozen. The room was small, but every object within it emanated a sense of unease. A massive wooden bed with an ornate, carved headboard stood in the center, its dark varnish cracked with age. Beside it was an antique nightstand, and on it, an old rotary phone, covered with a fine layer of dust. The phone looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, yet for some reason, it felt like an integral part of the room. I even thought I could hear a faint hum coming from it, though I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. I tossed my jacket onto the bed, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. In the corner of the room was a desk with an old lamp perched on it, its faded lampshade worn thin. I reached out to turn it on. The click of the switch sounded almost ominous, and the lamp flickered a few times before going out completely. I touched its cold metal frame. It was hopeless. It was a trivial thing, but for some reason, it irritated me. Or perhaps the issue wasn't the lamp at all, but the room itself, with its oppressive aura that seemed to tighten its grip on me with every passing moment. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to collect my thoughts and focus on my plans. But even in this seemingly mundane activity, something felt wrong. The heavy air in the room pressed down on me, as if gravity itself was stronger here. Everything around was unnaturally quiet until the silence was shattered by a sudden, jarring sound. The phone rang. I jolted, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could be calling? And why? For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the phone, trying to compose myself. The ringing continued, monotonous, insistent, as if something or someone demanded my attention. Finally, I mustered the courage to answer. I lifted the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice weak, almost rasping. On the other end, there was something that made me freeze. Silence. But it wasn't ordinary silence. It was tense, alive. In that silence, I could hear a faint rustling, something akin to heavy breathing. It was as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't bring themselves to do it. "Can you hear me?" I repeated, feeling cold sweat bead on my forehead. And then it happened. A whisper came through the receiver. Quiet, but perfectly clear. It was a child's voice. The sound of it sent chills racing down my spine. "You've come back," the voice said, and the words echoed in my mind like a shout in an empty room. I froze. What was that supposed to mean? Who was this? My heart pounded so hard I could hear it thudding in my ears. My entire body tensed, and my fingers, gripping the receiver, began to tremble. "Who are you? What kind of joke is this?" I blurted out, but my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Instead of answering, the voice whispered again, softer this time, almost imperceptibly. "They're already waiting." The words struck me like a bolt of lightning. They felt torn from another world, one far darker and more dangerous than I could comprehend. Suddenly, the line went dead. The receiver in my hand turned cold, as if I were holding a block of ice. The phone was silent. And with that, the room fell into a deep, terrifying stillness. I sat frozen, listening to the sound of my own breathing. This wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. There was something about those words, about that voice, that felt so disturbingly real it was impossible to ignore. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but there simply wasn't one. I could barely sleep that night. My mind was so on edge that every sound felt like an explosion in the silence. Even the tapping of my own fingers against the bed seemed unnervingly loud and out of place. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They came from the hallway outside my door. At first faint, barely audible, they slowly grew louder, as if someone was deliberately stepping carefully to avoid drawing too much attention. I froze, straining to listen. This couldn't be possible. The hotel was practically empty. I had seen the registry book. There was no one else here but me. Yet the footsteps continued, slow, steady, as though someone was wandering the corridor. Then they stopped, right outside my door. My heart pounded furiously. And then it happened. The doorknob shifted slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible movement, as if someone was testing it, trying to open the door. My mind warred between the urge to leap up and check who was there and the primal fear screaming at me, "Don't move." I resolved to do only one thing, lift my head and fix my gaze on the doorknob, waiting to see if it would move again. But the knob stayed still, and so did I. The light in the room, dim from the start, began to flicker ominously. The lamp's flashes, like faint heartbeats, cast unsettling shadows across the room until, at last, it went out completely. Darkness fell. A suffocating, oppressive darkness, like a blanket that had suddenly become unbearably heavy. And then I saw it. My eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, caught sight of a silhouette reflected in the mirror near the wardrobe. I froze, feeling the blood in my veins turn to ice. The silhouette was motionless, but it wasn't mine. It was distinctly human, yet at the same time, it wasn't. Its outlines were faintly blurred, as though its very existence was wrong, alien to this reality. I couldn't look away. Every second stretched into an eternity. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. Fear paralyzed my body, while my mind desperately searched for an explanation. Then the phone rang again. The sound, so mundane, struck like a lightning bolt in the tense atmosphere. I flinched, nearly jumping off the bed, but I couldn't bring myself to approach the phone. It rang again and again, each ring pounding against my nerves like a hammer. I stubbornly stayed where I was, clenching my fists, trying to convince myself this was just a coincidence. Eventually, the ringing stopped as abruptly as it had started. The room fell into such a profound silence that it was more terrifying than the sound of the phone. It felt as though even the noise of my own breathing had vanished. And in that silence, my fear reached its peak, transforming into something almost tangible, something that wrapped around me, tightening its grip with every passing moment. The next morning, I woke up feeling as though the air in the room had grown even heavier. Weak sunlight filtered through the old curtains, but even the sun's rays couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere. I needed to understand what was happening. Gathering my belongings as best I could in my state of tension, I decided to head to the local library. There, I hoped, I might find answers to the questions that had haunted me all night. The town seemed to go about its usual business, but I noticed something strange in the cautious glances of the locals, as if they knew something they weren't willing to discuss. At the library, I was greeted by an elderly librarian who gave me a sharp, searching look when I mentioned the old Pinewood Hotel. "You stayed there?" she asked in almost a whisper, her voice filled with unease. I nodded, not going into details. At first, she seemed reluctant to say anything, but my persistence eventually broke through her hesitation. "That hotel, it's had a bad reputation for a long time," she began, her tone hushed. "Back in the 1950s, several terrible things happened there. People who stayed in room 212 just vanished. Without a trace, without explanation. The police searched the hotel but never found anything. Only strange mentions in newspapers remain." I asked her for copies of the old articles, and after some hesitation, she brought me a stack of yellowed pages from the local papers. As I sifted through them, I read accounts that sent chills down my spine. They all described the same phenomena: guests hearing shadows that seemed to move around the room, late-night phone calls, whispers of strange, inexplicable words. And then, they simply disappeared. The articles mentioned these details. The librarian added, "But there's something else." She leaned in closer, her eyes darting nervously as if she feared someone might overhear. "They say that those who stayed in room 212 for more than one night never came back." My hands gripped the brittle pages tighter than necessary, almost tearing the fragile paper. Her words stuck in my mind like needles. Everything I had experienced the night before suddenly became even more terrifying. This wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't a prank. Something was truly, deeply wrong with that place. And I knew one thing for certain: returning to the hotel could be fatal. Returning to the hotel, I felt a mix of fear and determination. My instincts screamed for me to leave immediately, but something deep within urged me to stay. I thought about everything I had learned at the library, the stories of the missing people, the strange phenomena surrounding this hotel. Could I just walk away and leave it all unanswered? I decided to wait for another call, even if it meant putting myself at risk. Night fell quickly. The clock on the nightstand showed midnight as I sat on the bed, staring intently at the dark phone on the table. Time seemed to stand still as I waited. Then, as the clock struck 1, the phone rang. The sharp, chilling sound shattered the eerie silence of the room. I froze for a moment before slowly picking up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice unsteady. Once again, there was silence on the other end. But this time, it didn't last long. A voice, low and raspy, whispered, "They're here." The words cut through me like an icy blade. I barely had time to process what I'd heard when the lights in the room suddenly went out. In the complete darkness, I felt something, not a sound, but a presence, a faint, unmistakable breath. It was behind me. My heart stopped, but I forced myself to turn around. What I saw froze me to the core. Near the door stood a dark figure. It was motionless, yet its edges seemed to quiver, as if it were made not of flesh but of dense shadow. Most terrifying of all were its eyes. They glowed with a pale, cold light, lifeless and piercing, boring straight into me. My first reaction was instinctive. I rushed to the door, trying to open it. But it wouldn't budge, as if someone had locked it from the outside. I yanked the handle, pounded on the door, desperately trying to force it open, but it was no use. In that moment, I felt something cold and slimy touch my shoulder. It wasn't just a touch, it seemed to seep into me, draining the warmth from my body. I froze, unable to move. The shadows in the room began to shift and writhe, as though alive. They crept toward me slowly, coiling around me like serpents preparing to strike. The cold enveloped me, and a sense of utter helplessness welled up inside. The shadows were here, they were real, and I realized, this place wasn't going to let me go so easily. I ran out of the hotel as soon as dawn broke. The air outside felt heavy, but it was far lighter than the suffocating atmosphere within. I didn't look back, didn't glance at the grim facade of the old Pinewood, fearing I might see something I couldn't bear. The key to room 212 was still in my pocket, but I didn't dare return it. All I wanted was to get as far away as possible. As I drove beyond the town limits, I began to feel a slight sense of relief, though it was fleeting. Something lingered. It wasn't the sensation of being followed in the physical sense, but a weight, a heavy stone pressing on my chest that refused to let go. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure with the glowing eyes staring back at me. But that was only the beginning. On the very first night after returning home, I was startled awake by a sound. The phone. My ordinary landline phone on the desk was ringing. I froze, a shiver running through me. It was impossible. The ringing sounded exactly like it had in the hotel. I picked up the receiver, my hands trembling, and was met with silence. But it wasn't ordinary silence. It was familiar. And then, the faintest whisper. "We are always here." I slammed the phone down, but sleep never came back. These calls became a part of my life. At first, they came only at night, but soon they invaded my dreams. The same words, the same voices whispering things I was too terrified to understand. Sometimes, I hear faint rustling in my room, even when I'm certain I'm alone. Faint shadows flicker on the walls, and I feel that same cold breath on my neck that had paralyzed me in room 212. The past hasn't let me go. It holds me tightly, like chains wrapped around my consciousness. And while I will never return to the old Pinewood, I know one thing, it will always be with me.